The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. Snow whipped across the ground in frenzied gusts, swirling under the dim glow of streetlights that flickered like dying stars. It was the kind of night where even the most desperate souls sought shelter, where the world outside fell silent, suffocated beneath the weight of the storm. Inside a small, weathered house at the edge of town, a man sat alone, his thoughts as restless as the storm outside. He had never been fond of winter, the cold seeped into his bones no matter how many layers he wore. Nights like this only reminded him of how hollow his home had become over the years. The microwave hummed faintly in the background, its digital timer ticking down the seconds until his meager dinner would be ready. He rubbed a hand over the stubble on his jaw, listening to the relentless battering of the wind against the windows. Then, sudden and sharp, came 3 knocks at the door. His brow furrowed. No one came knocking at this hour, not in this part of the city, not in this weather. His neighbors weren't the friendly type, and he hadn't left anyone who might visit unannounced. For a moment, he debated ignoring it, but something about the sound, the way it echoed hollow and urgent, made his gut tighten. Reluctantly, he stood and made his way to the door. When he pulled it open, the world seemed to stop. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. The snow had piled high on the doorstep, and nestled within it was a small bundle of fabric. Something shifted inside, something alive. Golden eyes fluttered open, locking onto his with a quiet, pleading whimper. A baby. But not human. His breath hitched as he took in the tiny, fragile form curled within the blankets. Its skin was a deep dusky blue, its small fingers tipped with delicate claws. A faint luminescence clung to it, barely visible under the porch light, as if the child carried the last remnants of some dying starlight within its skin. His gaze lifted, and for the first time, he noticed the figure standing just beyond the porch, half hidden in the swirling snow. She was tall, easily taller than him, even with the way she hunched in exhaustion. Her long black hair clung to her face, wet with melted snow, and her striking features were lined with something far deeper than just cold, hunger, fear, desperation. She was an alien, one of the refugees left stranded on Earth after the war. Everyone had heard about them. The war had ended years ago, but its wounds still bled. These beings had once commanded the stars, but now they were scattered, unwanted, abandoned, and slowly fading into extinction. The baby let out another soft cry, snapping him back to reality. She had left it here on his doorstep. His stomach twisted. Had she been turned away so many times? How many doors had she knocked on, only to be met with cruelty or silence? How many times had she begged for work, for food, for a place to sleep, only to be denied? And now here she was, in the middle of a snowstorm, looking at him like he was her last hope. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to think. This wasn't his problem. He didn't know her. The smart thing would be to close the door, pretend he hadn't seen anything, and let someone else deal with it. But then the baby shifted in the blankets, its tiny hand curling into a fist against the cold. Something cracked inside his chest. Before he could second-guess himself, he bent down and scooped the baby into his arms. It was so light, too light. The moment he held it close, it stilled, as if instinctively recognizing warmth and safety. When he looked up, the woman, the mother, was still standing there. She hadn't moved. She was shivering violently, her thin clothing soaked through. Her golden eyes locked onto his face with a raw, unreadable expression. Then, slowly, her gaze flickered to the child in his arms. She thought he was going to take it inside and leave her out here. He swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "Get in here," he muttered, stepping back. "Both of you." She flinched, hesitating. For a long moment, she didn't move. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear, as if this was a trick, as if he would slam the door in her face the moment she stepped forward. But then she saw the way he was holding her child. Something in her expression shifted, and with slow, cautious steps, she crossed the threshold. He shut the door behind her, sealing out the storm. She flinched again, subtly, but he caught it, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers twitched at her sides, as if preparing to defend herself. He could only imagine what she had been through. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice even. She didn't respond. She just stood there, dripping melted snow onto the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Now that she was inside, he could see just how bad off she was. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollowed from hunger. The deep blue of her skin, which should have been rich and vibrant, was faded and dull. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. The baby made a soft noise against his chest, and he instinctively shifted his grip, adjusting the tiny weight in his arms. It nuzzled against him, its breathing evening out. He sighed. "You hungry?" The woman inhaled sharply. He watched as her throat bobbed, her jaw tightening. There was a long pause, pride warring with survival, then finally, she whispered, "Yes." The house was warm, almost stifling compared to the icy world outside. The sudden change in temperature made her shudder as melted snow dripped from her clothes onto the wooden floor. He noticed how her arms wrapped tightly around herself, fingers digging into the fabric of her battered sleeves as if she were trying to hold herself together. Exhaustion radiated from her in waves, but it was more than physical fatigue, it was something deeper, more hollow. She stood frozen near the doorway, golden eyes darting between him and the baby still nestled against his chest. There was hesitation in her gaze, uncertainty. She didn't trust him yet, and he couldn't blame her. "Come on," he said, keeping his voice even and careful. He nodded toward the couch, the only piece of furniture in the small living room that looked remotely comfortable. "Sit. You need to get warm." For a moment, he thought she wouldn't move, but then, almost reluctantly, she stepped forward. Her legs trembled beneath her, and when she reached the couch, she sank onto it as if every ounce of her strength had been drained. He exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his damp hair. He wasn't good at this, the whole comforting strangers thing. Hell, he wasn't even sure what he was supposed to do here. He had let her in, but now what? The baby stirred against him, letting out a soft whimper, and the sound seemed to snap her back to life. She sat up straighter, eyes locking onto the child with a sharp intensity. "She needs to eat," she whispered, her voice raw with urgency. Her accent was light but unmistakable, the syllables softened in a way that was unique to her people's tongue. He blinked, then nodded. "Yeah. You too." He turned toward the kitchen before she could argue, setting the baby down carefully in the bundle of blankets on the couch beside her. The little one made a small noise, but as soon as she felt the warmth of her mother nearby, she settled. The kitchen was a mess of half-used ingredients and dishes that he had never been particularly good at keeping organized. He wasn't much of a cook, most nights, dinner consisted of whatever he could throw together with minimal effort. But now wasn't the time for laziness. He reached for a can of soup, twisting off the lid before pouring it into a pot. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and more importantly, it was something he could make quickly. He set it on the stove, turning the heat up high, then grabbed a half loaf of bread from the counter. It was a little stale, but it was food, it would have to do. When he turned back, he found her watching him from the couch. Her eyes flickered to the soup, then to the bread in his hands. There was no hiding the way her throat bobbed, the way her fingers curled against her lap as if resisting the urge to reach out. "Not much," he admitted, setting everything down on the small table in front of her, "but it's warm." She hesitated for half a second, then she reached forward, her hand shaking as she tore off a piece of bread and brought it to her lips. The moment the food touched her tongue, something in her broke. She ate like a woman who hadn't seen a meal in days, maybe longer. Each bite was fast, desperate, her body too starved to care about anything other than filling the aching void in her stomach. He didn't say anything. He just sat back in the chair across from her, letting her eat in silence. When the soup was gone and the bread had been reduced to crumbs, her breathing was unsteady, not from exhaustion this time, but from something dangerously close to relief. Then, as if remembering why she had been so frantic in the first place, she turned to the bundle on the couch. The baby had begun to stir again, her tiny hands twitching, a soft cry bubbling up from her throat. Without hesitation, she reached for her, scooping her up into her arms and cradling her close. She murmured something in her native tongue, a low, melodic sound that he didn't understand but recognized instantly as something intimate, something ancient. Then she hesitated. He saw the way her body tensed, the way her grip on the child tightened. Her golden eyes darted toward him, and for the first time since stepping into his home, she looked afraid, not afraid of him, but afraid of what she was about to do. He frowned, about to ask what was wrong, but then he saw the way she shifted, the way she adjusted her hold on the child. And then he understood. She was going to feed her, of course. It should have been obvious, but the moment realization set in, so did her discomfort. He could see it in the way her shoulders hunched, the way she turned slightly as if trying to shield herself. Her kind were different, more reserved. He had read somewhere, back when the war was still fresh and humanity was still trying to understand them, that they treated certain acts with more delicacy, more reverence. This wasn't just nourishment, it was something sacred. And now she was in a stranger's home with no privacy, no dignity left to protect. He shifted uncomfortably, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He cleared his throat. I can give you a minute if you want. She inhaled sharply, hesitated, then gave a quick, barely perceptible nod. He stood, making his way toward the hallway. He stopped just before rounding the corner and glanced back. She was already turning away, curling in on herself, the baby nestled securely against her chest. He saw the way she ducked her head, the way she closed her eyes, not just from exhaustion, but from shame. And suddenly, he hated that she felt that way. He wanted to say something, to tell her it was fine, that she had no reason to feel embarrassed, but the words wouldn't come. So instead, he did the only thing he could, he gave her space. As the minutes passed, the quiet between them grew less tense, though it remained heavy with unspoken truths. The woman finished feeding the baby, her movements deliberate and gentle, as if each action carried the weight of ritual. She wrapped the child back in the blankets and rocked her softly, whispering in her native tongue. The melody of her voice, though unfamiliar, carried a soothing cadence that seemed to settle even the air around them. Daniel lingered by the hallway, his presence unnoticed. Or perhaps simply unacknowledged, as he observed the scene. Watching her care for the infant, he couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between her earlier desperation and the calm tenderness she now exuded. It was as if, in those moments of connection with her child, she became someone entirely different, softer, surer, less burdened. Once the baby was asleep, she carefully placed her on the couch, tucking the blanket snugly around her. Only then did she sit back, her posture rigid but her shoulders visibly lower, as if some invisible weight had been momentarily lifted. She glanced at him briefly, her golden eyes flickering with a mix of gratitude and caution. He took that as his cue to return to the living room, moving slowly so as not to startle her. When he re-entered, he placed a steaming mug of tea on the table in front of her. She stared at it for a moment, her expression unreadable, before reaching out tentatively. Her fingers brushed the ceramic surface, and she paused, as if unsure whether to accept the gesture. Finally, she wrapped her hands around the mug, drawing comfort from its warmth rather than its contents. Daniel sat across from her, leaning forward slightly with his elbows resting on his knees. You don't have to ration it, he said, breaking the silence. Eat. Drink. There's more. His tone was neutral, but his words carried an undercurrent of reassurance. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Taking another sip of tea, she seemed to relax incrementally, though her guard remained firmly in place. The quiet stretched between them again, punctuated only by the faint crackling of the radiator and the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping baby. Daniel studied her carefully, noting the subtle changes in her demeanor. The tension in her shoulders had eased, not completely, but enough that she no longer looked like a cornered animal waiting for the trap to spring. Still, he could see the toll her journey had taken. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones pronounced against her pale blue skin. Faint scars traced her forearms, their origins unknown but telling nonetheless. Even seated, she held herself with a poised alertness, as though rest itself was a luxury she couldn't afford. After a while, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Why did you let us in?" The question hung in the air, simple yet profound. Daniel wasn't prepared for it, but he answered honestly. "Because you needed help. And because no one else did." His response was straightforward, devoid of embellishment or pretense. Yet it carried a weight that resonated deeply. She met his gaze, searching for something, perhaps sincerity, perhaps understanding, and found it. For the first time since entering his home, the suspicion in her eyes softened. She nodded once, a small but meaningful acknowledgement. Their exchange marked the beginning of an uneasy truce. Though neither trusted the other fully, there was a mutual recognition of shared vulnerability. Both were survivors in their own right, navigating a world shaped by loss and hardship. For him, it was the emptiness of solitude, for her, the relentless struggle to protect her child in a hostile environment. Their circumstances were worlds apart, yet they intersected in ways neither could have anticipated. In that moment, as they sat across from one another in the dimly lit room, two lives began to intertwine, not out of obligation, but out of necessity. Her story unfolded in fragments, pieced together between sips of tea and stolen glances at the sleeping child. She spoke haltingly at first, her voice barely above a whisper, as if testing the waters of trust. Each word carried the weight of memories she had fought to bury, yet could never fully escape. The war, she explained, had left her people scattered, their once proud civilization reduced to remnants drifting through human-controlled space. They had been scholars and warriors, masters of the stars, but now they were refugees, unwanted, abandoned, and slowly fading into obscurity. Her own journey had been one of constant motion, a desperate search for shelter that led her to countless doors, only to find them slammed in her face. Some had turned her away before she could even speak, others had been cruel, their rejection laced with disdain. Hunger and exhaustion had become her constant companions, gnawing at her resolve with every passing day. As she recounted her struggles, Daniel listened intently, his brow furrowed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had known the stories of the Volari refugees, of course, everyone had, but hearing them firsthand painted a picture far bleaker than any news report could convey. The systemic neglect, the hostility masked as indifference, the sheer impossibility of finding safety in a world that viewed her kind as burdens rather than beings, it all crystallized in her words. "Weeks," she murmured at one point, her voice trembling. "Maybe more. I lost count." Weeks spent braving the biting cold, clutching her child to her chest as she wandered from neighborhood to neighborhood, hoping against hope for a sliver of compassion. Weeks enduring the stares of strangers, their faces etched with suspicion or outright contempt. Weeks fighting not just for survival, but for dignity. Daniel's chest tightened as he absorbed the enormity of her ordeal. He thought of the baby, so small and fragile, nestled against her mother's chest. How had they endured such conditions? What kept them going when every step forward seemed to lead only to another dead end? The questions swirled in his mind, but he dared not voice them. Instead, he focused on the present, on the fact that they were here now, safe, if only temporarily, under his roof. "You're strong," he said finally, his voice low but firm. It wasn't a question or an observation, but a statement meant to anchor her in the truth of her resilience. She looked at him then, her golden eyes searching his face for mockery or pity. Finding neither, she exhaled softly and nodded, almost as if convincing herself. The baby stirred in her sleep, letting out a soft whimper that drew both their attention. Instinctively, the woman reached for her, smoothing a hand over the blanket to soothe her. The movement was fluid, practiced, born of months spent protecting and nurturing her child in the face of overwhelming odds. Daniel watched silently, struck by the intimacy of the moment. Despite everything she had endured, her love for the infant remained unwavering, a beacon of light cutting through the darkness of her circumstances. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that her strength was brittle, a fragile construct held together by sheer willpower and fear of what might happen if she faltered. "What happens next?" he asked eventually, breaking the silence. His question hung in the air, unanswered but heavy with implication. Neither of them knew what lay ahead, but both understood that staying here indefinitely was not an option. The world outside was unforgiving, and the longer they remained, the greater the risk of discovery. Still, for now, they were safe. For now, they had each other. And perhaps, Daniel thought, that was enough. As the hours stretched into the early morning, the conversation between them shifted, becoming less about survival and more about the ghosts that haunted them. The woman hesitated at first, her golden eyes clouded with something Daniel recognized immediately: grief. It was a look he'd worn himself, reflected in countless mirrors during the loneliest nights of his life. He waited patiently, giving her the space to speak or remain silent, whichever she chose. Eventually, her voice broke the stillness, soft and measured. "You've lost people too," she said, not as a question but as a statement. Her observation startled him, though he shouldn't have been surprised. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, the shadows in his eyes, or the faint tremor in his hands when he sipped his coffee, signs that even he hadn't realized were so visible. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. Names he hadn't spoken aloud in years surfaced unbidden, their echoes sharp and painful. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice rough. "I lost a lot." The admission came easier than he expected, though it cost him something to say it. He didn't elaborate, didn't share the details of the battles he'd fought or the comrades he'd buried. Those stories belonged to another time, another version of himself, one he wasn't ready to revisit. But the acknowledgement was enough. She seemed to understand, her expression softening ever so slightly. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, united not by words but by the weight of shared sorrow. Then, without warning, she reached across the table. Her movement was hesitant, almost imperceptible, but deliberate. Her fingertips grazed the back of his hand, the contact fleeting yet profoundly significant. Daniel froze, unsure how to respond. Physical touch between humans and her kind was rare, often avoided altogether. Yet here she was, bridging a gap he hadn't realized existed. He didn't pull away. Instead, he let her gesture linger, the warmth of her skin against his a reminder that they were not so different after all. Her hand retreated as quickly as it had appeared, but the air between them had changed. The walls that had stood between them, invisible yet impenetrable, had cracked. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to consider the possibility that this encounter wasn't just about offering shelter or ensuring survival. It was about connection, a fragile, tentative thread spun for mutual loss and resilience. As she withdrew her hand and wrapped it around her mug once more, he realized that she wasn't just seeking refuge in his home. She was seeking solace, a place where her pain could be acknowledged without judgment. And perhaps, in some small way, he was doing the same. It was the unnatural stillness that first set Daniel on edge. The alley behind his house, usually alive with the distant hum of traffic or the occasional scuffle of stray cats, was eerily silent. Even the wind, which had howled relentlessly all night, seemed to have abated, leaving behind a vacuum of sound that pressed against his ears like a weight. He paused mid-step, the trash bag in his hand momentarily forgotten, as unease prickled along his spine. Something felt off. Slowly, he turned back toward the house, his senses sharpening as he scanned the street. Shadows stretched long and dark between the buildings, their edges blurred in the dim glow of the streetlights. Nothing moved. The crunch of snow beneath his boots sounded unnaturally loud as he stepped onto the porch, his eyes darting toward the windows. Everything appeared normal, curtains drawn, lights off, but the silence was deafening. He shook his head, trying to dispel the irrational tension coiling in his chest. "You're imagining things," he muttered under his breath, unlocking the door and stepping inside. The warmth of the house enveloped him, a stark contrast to the frigid air outside, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to relax. He shrugged off his coat, ran a hand through his hair, and listened to the faint sounds coming from the living room, the soft murmur of the woman speaking in her native tongue, the baby's contented sighs. Yet the unease refused to dissipate. It lingered at the edges of his awareness, a nagging sensation that something was amiss. He glanced toward the window, catching a glimpse of the street bathed in the pale light of dawn. Still nothing moved. Still, the silence persisted. He frowned, crossing the room to peer through the blinds. That's when he saw it, a flicker of movement, barely perceptible, near the corner of the building across the street. His pulse quickened. Someone was watching the house. The sharp knock shattered the quiet like glass, reverberating through the house with a precision that left no room for doubt. This was no accidental visitor. Daniel's body went rigid, every muscle tensing as adrenaline surged through him. Across the room, the woman reacted instantly, her entire posture shifting from exhaustion to alertness in a heartbeat. Her golden eyes snapped toward the door, wide and wary, as she instinctively positioned herself between the baby and the entrance. The infant stirred against her chest but remained quiet, sensing the sudden tension in the air. Daniel moved first, stepping toward the door with deliberate calm despite the storm raging inside him. He glanced back at her, his voice low and steady. "Take her and go to the back room." His words were a command, not a suggestion. The woman hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding, her grip tightening around the baby. Without another word, she rose smoothly and disappeared down the hallway, her movements silent and controlled. Only when he heard the soft click of the bedroom door closing did Daniel turn his full attention to the front of the house. He approached the entrance cautiously, peering through the peephole. Two figures stood outside, men, neither wearing uniforms but both radiating an authority that made his stomach churn. The older of the two had a weathered face and short cropped hair, his stance relaxed yet commanding. His younger companion, thinner and more wiry, fidgeted slightly, his hands hovering just out of sight. Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't need to see badges or weapons to know they weren't here for a friendly chat. Unlocking the door, he opened it just wide enough to step halfway into the frame, blocking their view of the interior. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice even but edged with caution. The older man tilted his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over Daniel with a practiced scrutiny. "You Carter?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. Daniel didn't answer immediately, crossing his arms and leaning against the doorframe instead. "Who's asking?" he replied, his tone deliberately neutral. The younger man glanced toward the window, his eyes lingering on the faint outline of the living room beyond. "You got a guest staying with you?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of forced nonchalance. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears, but he kept his expression impassive. "What's it to you?" he countered, his voice sharper now. The older man exhaled through his nose, clearly unimpressed. "Look," he said, his tone hardening, "we know a Volari woman's been seen in this neighborhood. A woman with a baby. We're not saying you have her, but if you did, it'd be in your best interest to tell us." The implications hung heavy in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Daniel clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew exactly what happened to Volari refugees when they were caught, deportation at best, disappearance at worst. His mind raced, weighing his options. Finally, he managed a dry chuckle, injecting a note of dismissive sarcasm into his voice. "A Volari in this neighborhood? You think one of them would last 5 minutes around here?" The younger man smirked, as if amused by the idea, but the older man's eyes narrowed. If you see anything, he said, his voice laced with warning, you let us know. Daniel didn't respond, his gaze unwavering as he watched them turn and walk back down the street. Only when they were out of sight did he allow himself to exhale, the breath shaky and uneven. Locking the door behind him, he turned back toward the hallway. The woman was already there, standing in the shadows, her golden eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and determination. They will come back, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. I know. The clock ticked relentlessly on the wall, each second stretching into an eternity as Daniel paced the length of the living room. Outside, the storm had resumed its assault, the wind rattling the windows and the snow piling higher against the door. Inside, the atmosphere was equally charged, though the tension stemmed not from the weather but from the unspoken knowledge that their fragile sanctuary had been compromised. The woman sat on the edge of the couch, her arms wrapped protectively around the baby, who had drifted back to sleep despite the earlier commotion. Her golden eyes followed Daniel's movements, tracking his every step with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. We need to leave, she said finally, her voice low but firm. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Daniel stopped pacing, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He had known this moment was inevitable, had felt it looming over them since the first knock at the door. But hearing her say it aloud sent a sharp pang through his chest, one he hadn't anticipated. I know, he replied, his voice rough. But where? They'll be watching the roads, the transport hubs, every exit out of the city. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the baby nestled against her chest. There are places, she said after a pause, her voice tinged with a hope that sounded almost foreign in its optimism. Places my people go. Safe places. If I can reach one of them, we'll be okay. Her certainty was admirable, but Daniel couldn't ignore the cracks in her armor, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her jaw tightened as if bracing for an argument. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her, his eyes level with hers. And what if you don't make it? He asked gently, his tone probing but not accusatory. Her silence was answer enough. She hadn't considered that possibility, or perhaps she had chosen not to dwell on it. Survival had been her sole focus for so long that the idea of failure must have seemed too unbearable to entertain. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. Running isn't enough, he said, his voice firm. We need a plan. You can't just disappear into the city and hope for the best. She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Then what do you suggest? She asked, her voice soft but steady. Daniel hesitated, the weight of the decision settling heavily on his shoulders. He had spent years keeping his head down, avoiding trouble, ensuring that the war remained nothing more than a distant memory. Now, he was being asked to abandon that carefully constructed life, to trade safety for uncertainty, solitude for solidarity. It was a leap he hadn't planned for, one that terrified him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. We stick together, he said finally, his voice resolute. You don't know this city like I do. You don't know which streets are watched, who to avoid. You need someone who does. Her eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face. You're coming with us? She asked, her tone betraying a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. I'm not letting you do this alone, he said firmly. We run together, or we don't run at all. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, her golden eyes searching his face as if trying to decipher some hidden motive. Finally, she exhaled softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. All right, she murmured, her voice heavy with unspoken emotion. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was something deeper, something that acknowledged the fragility of their alliance and the strength it would take to sustain it. With the decision made, they moved with a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation. Time was no longer a luxury they could afford, and every second wasted was a second closer to discovery. Daniel started in his bedroom, pulling an old backpack from the top shelf of his closet. It was battered and worn, its straps frayed from years of disuse, but it would serve its purpose. He stuffed it methodically, prioritizing essentials: canned food, bottled water, extra clothes. His hands trembled slightly as he worked, not from fear but from the gravity of what he was leaving behind. This wasn't just a house, it was a life, one he had built brick by brick over years of solitude. Now, it was being dismantled just as deliberately, piece by piece. Weapons were scarce, but he managed to gather what little he had: an old hunting knife, its blade dulled from lack of use, and a battered revolver he hadn't fired in years. He checked the chamber, ensuring it was loaded, before slipping it into the side pocket of the backpack. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he zipped the bag shut, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. His reflection startled him, dark circles under his eyes, his jaw clenched in determination. He looked like a man preparing for battle, though the enemy was unseen and the outcome uncertain. In the living room, the woman worked with equal precision, her movements efficient and deliberate. She packed lightly, focusing on what the baby needed most: blankets, a spare set of clothes, a small pouch filled with something Daniel couldn't identify. Her military training was evident in the way she double-checked everything, ensuring nothing vital was overlooked. When she caught him watching, she offered a faint smile, though her golden eyes remained guarded. "We'll be ready soon," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. The baby stirred in her makeshift crib, letting out a soft whimper that drew both their attention. The woman crossed the room in an instant, scooping the child into her arms and murmuring softly in her native tongue. The baby quieted almost immediately, her tiny fingers grasping at the fabric of her mother's shirt. Daniel watched the scene unfold, a lump forming in his throat. This was what they were fighting for, not just survival, but the chance for a life untainted by fear. As they finished packing, Daniel hesitated, his hand resting on the doorknob. Once they walked out that door, there would be no turning back. The quiet predictability of his routine, the sanctuary of his solitude, it would all be gone. He glanced back at the woman, who stood near the window, her gaze fixed on the street outside. She didn't look at him, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around the baby. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded once, her expression resolute. "Let's go." The city loomed around them, its streets cloaked in darkness save for the occasional flicker of a distant street lamp. Daniel led the way, his steps deliberate as he guided them through a labyrinth of alleys and backstreets. Each turn was calculated, each pause a moment to listen for the telltale signs of danger: footsteps, voices, the hum of an engine. Behind him, the woman moved with equal care, her golden eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. She held the baby close, her body a shield against the unknown dangers that lurked in the urban sprawl. The baby, sensing the tension, remained eerily silent, her small hands gripping the fabric of her mother's shirt as if anchoring herself to safety. Theirs was a journey of silence and vigilance, broken only by the occasional rustle of fabric or the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. Words were unnecessary, their shared purpose bound them together more tightly than any conversation could. Daniel's mind raced, mapping out routes and contingencies, his years of familiarity with the city proving invaluable. He navigated them away from main thoroughfares, choosing instead the forgotten pathways that wound through industrial zones and abandoned lots. Here, the city felt like a ghost town, its usual chaos muted by the late hour and the oppressive weight of the storm. Hours passed in a blur of motion and anticipation. The skyline, jagged and foreboding, began to recede as they neared the outskirts of the city. The transition was gradual, marked by fewer buildings and wider stretches of open land. By the time nightfall descended fully, they stood at the edge of civilization, the lights of the city twinkling faintly behind them. The woman paused, glancing back at the horizon. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of relief and trepidation. For so long, the city had been both her prison and her battleground. Now, she was leaving it behind, stepping into the unknown. Daniel followed her gaze, his thoughts mirroring her own. "Where to now?" he asked, his voice low but steady. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing as if weighing their options. Finally, she turned to him, her golden eyes gleaming with a newfound determination. "There's a ship," she said, her voice carrying a note of cautious hope. "A transport. It leaves for the outer colonies in 2 days. If we can reach it, we'll be safe." Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we keep moving." Under the cover of night, the cargo ship lifted off from its hidden launch site, its engines roaring softly against the vast expanse of the frozen countryside. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, casting a warm glow over the small group of passengers who had managed to secure passage. Among them sat a human man and a Volari woman, their forms silhouetted against the faint light streaming through the porthole windows. Between them, nestled securely in a makeshift cradle of blankets, lay a sleeping child. Her tiny chest rose and fell with each peaceful breath, oblivious to the monumental journey unfolding around her. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, neither adult felt the need to glance over their shoulder. They had escaped, together. The settlement they sought was unlike anything either of them had known. Nestled along the banks of a winding river, it stretched across rolling green hills bathed in the golden light of twin suns. The air was warm and fragrant, carrying the scent of wildflowers that swayed lazily in the breeze. Unlike the harsh, unforgiving cities they had left behind, this place exuded a quiet serenity, a sense of renewal that seemed almost other.